So Senator Mike Lee, who goes by Based Mike Lee, who I love his X handle. I think that that's absolutely hilarious that our senator used the word based. It's funny and awesome, but not necessarily supportive of his idea to sell public lands. However, in the Senate, this was blocked by the parliamentarian. It said that you actually need 60 votes to get this in. So this has been stripped from the bill. So this is no longer a part of what's being considered. Getting to 60 votes might as well be like trying to jump to the moon in the current disposition of the Senate. So this is not going anywhere. But we are all talking about this at this point because he's been trying to do this for some time now. Lucas, fill me in on what's going on here. He's been trying to do this. You are somewhat supportive of this, but with a twist, right?
Oh, with a lot of twists. First of all, we should remark that Mike Lee, Senator Lee, is a senator from Utah, and this is a long-running dispute between, especially Utah, but many of the Western states. And I would also like to add some nuance. We say public land, but this is federally managed land.
Yeah, you've got to help us understand the distinction here because what is the difference between public land and federally managed land? Those seem like a difference without a distinction there.
Okay, well, before even this publicly managed land, because it's truly federally managed land, we should ask ourselves why we have phrases like public land and property rights. And you'll notice that we have these phrases, but we don't talk. Very few people talk about private land or personal land. And this goes
So
back
is
to
this land that the federal government purchased when they did like the Louisiana purchase and Western land purchases from various different entities? Is that what's happened here? Is that the federal government bought it and they retained ownership of it when they purchased it?
so some of it's land purchased in the Louisiana purchased. Some of it is land that was taken through the Mexican American War. In fact, a lot of it is land that was taken from Mexico in the Mexican American War in 1850. So the again, to go back to the even before the Constitution, there was an argument amongst the settlers about native concepts of political order and European concepts of political order. Part of the American experiment was to crawl away from classed society. Everyone here was supposed to be equal. Part of the detente that was brought over, so we weren't going to be wholly like Europe. There wasn't going to be the ability to own land. So so this notion of public land in some ways is obfuscate. Which level of government owns or controls the land. And if we look at who assesses land taxes, counties assess land tax. But part of the reason that
Wait, so you're asking which branch of the government? I mean,
Yeah, I
very
was just about to ask. I mean, does that get into, is it federally controlled land or is it state controlled land? Or is it something like that goes into state rights over federal rights to be able to sell this land?
I mean, it's even I would say that it's not even so much about state rights, but county rights. If you imagine generations before us, I mean, this even gets to our arguments about public schooling. Public schooling came from the land that was set aside in each county for the school system, and the land taxes contributed to contributed to everyone's education. Now, for instance, in the state of Texas, I think also in the state of Colorado, money gets pooled and taken from not just the land tax or the property tax, which are also different. Property are things that you place on the real property are things that you place on the land. The reason we call it real goes back to Spanish or Latin real, kingly property. Back to Europe, whenever the king actually owned all of the property and was parceling that out amongst his vassals in a quid pro quo for contributions to defense. how many knights will you send me if I call on you? So yes, we should pay attention to who is actually controlling the land. And if we go to John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States, one of my favorite phrases that he uttered was, "To tax is to control," and he was very prescient and very right about that. So fast forward to today, in the westward expansion of the United States, the federal government bought or waged war on other countries, and it maintained its control of that. It did not pass that land over to the states. Its rationale for that was, in part, sometimes states owed the federal government money. Sometimes it just, well, in many cases, the states didn't owe money, but the federal government said, we surveyed the land. We sent federal workers out to measure and mark the distances of the land, and also to evaluate the resources and the agricultural the agricultural potential of the land. And because we have put that much effort into it, then we don't trust the state to manage it, and we're going to find qualified parties who are going to improve our investment in surveying and managing that land. They've held on to it through all of these years. States like Utah are largely, in part, still federally managed. Nevada, I think Montana, Colorado is a large amount of federally managed land. We also have on top of that, because if you think about some of these bureaucracies that we run into when we're in the West, you have the Bureau of Water Reclamation. That's all the dams and all the water that's tossed out. You have the Bureau of Forest Management. But if you'll notice, they don't get into talking about who actually owns the land, and that's because that's a sticky situation. And in reality, the states wrote a constitution that governed the counties, and the counties were in charge of the land. You'll also come to the concept of PILT, which is payment in lieu of taxes. Because government entities don't pay tax on their land, you would ask yourself, well, how do some of these counties that are largely federally managed land, if the federal government isn't paying taxes to them, how are they to function? And the government gets around that by paying PILT, P-I-L-T, payment in lieu of taxes. Isn't that a great Orwellian phrase? So this is part of, I guess, the context and the history of behind Mike Lee's resolution that he suggested for the Senate to take up, and the Senate has deigned not to do so. But
went in a very procedural way. It seemed kind of esoteric the way that this was taken out. Doesn't seem to be a lot of support from the public on this. Are people just generally thinking about this wrong? Is what Mike Lee is trying to do is return control of these lands to the states, or is he trying to sell it off to BlackRock? I think there's a lot of fear that what's going to end up happening is that the private corporations are going to come in here and somehow loot the U.S., or that China is going to end up owning this stuff. And I think that's the general fear, is the best of intentions end up with unintended consequences.
So he has said that in the bill, or possible to add to it, were provisions that denied foreign nation states this fear about China owning farmland in the United States, or large corporations from owning the land. I don't know how real that is, because once you sell that land, individual citizens are given the privilege of exercising contract. So if you sell it to 100 people and then BlackRock turns around and buys it from them, it still belongs in the hands of BlackRock. So I don't know that Mike Lee has thought, or possibly he has thought about that, but he's looking to fight this battle of bringing federally managed land back under local control. And this is, I enjoyed many public managed lands, many national parks, many national monument areas. I used to live in Durango, in western Colorado. I lived in a town that was totally surrounded for 100 miles on every side by BLM land, and so I'm quite familiar with it.
Well, now there's a new term that we haven't come up yet, which is the Bureau of Land Management. So this is the department that's responsible for administering these lands, because you can go camp out and just live on BLM land as much as you want. That's kind of one of the only places in the US where you can just go exist for free, right?
Yes. And I also don't know that. So yes, there's the BLM, or the Bureau of Land Management. I don't know that people realize how maybe banal a lot of the federally managed land is, and also what goes on with this federally managed land.
I mean, mostly it's just private ranchers going to put their cattle on it, as far as what I can tell. Isn't that mostly what happens on these lands? Is they just
Well,
leave the livestock on there?
that was for a long time the practice of and the relationship between the BLM and the National Forest and privately held interest. You would have land adjacent to BLM or federally managed land, whoever it was under, and you would get grazing permits, and there was a bidding process for those grazing permits. You had to enter in that you were a stakeholder. So part of when I look at this system, I say, well, it is a boondoggle to people who own land, who own private land next to it, and those are the ones who cry foul most. You can put into this basket the Bundys. If you remember the Malfour refuge in Oregon and the Bundy standoff in Mesquite, Nevada, that argument was over the fines and the fees that the BLM had assessed ranchers who were not paying for their grazing permits. With that aside, the federal government has been moving away from grazing permits, partially because of these problems, but also because they found other streams of revenue, and those streams of revenue are drilling and fracking. And if you go to the forests, it is the selling of trees in the forest to private lumber companies. So I think there's this notion that people have in their mind when they're thinking of federally managed land that it's all national parks. It's not all national parks, and the rewards from it. I'm much more for breaking up the federal management, because it often overlooks the desires and the interests of local populations. And it also takes the control of the tax base and the industrial base out of the hands of local populations. And so when I look at the model that I would rather have, it looks like Switzerland. And I don't know that Switzerland has, this notion that you're going to have mountains and nobody's going to live in them at certain elevations, and we're going to have these ubiquitous rules and expectations that are enacted by most people who live under 2,000 feet elevation, and you're living at 10,000 feet elevation. You have expectations for your building code that come from somewhere else, or how wide your streets are going to be, or any number of other things. And and we've stripped some of the nuance and the possibility about how we relate to nature. And I also should add that I don't think when I think about this relationship to nature and these parks that we've made, I don't see local or state control as removing that from being a reality in our lives. I actually see it as giving us many more. And as a climber, or maybe I should say a former climber, because this is a fraught issue about access to public lands. And climbers are hollering and screaming against this. But meanwhile, going back to this understanding that people can buy all the private land around public land and then restrict access to it, that's the reality of what's happening. And so I would rather see, a climbing wall in Uniweep Canyon, Colorado, bought by a consortium of climbers, and for us to move. If there's a stream somewhere that has perfect trout, why is there not an expectation that a group of stakeholders, a club of some sort, would be purchasing that and not relying on the goodwill of society for saying, it's acceptable to fish here, or no, we're gonna leave these fish in the water and have some sort of idea of wilderness in the area.
Well, I mean, what's the real difference here? If people can go fish on that, why does it have to be bought by a consortium of fishermen? It's already available to the fishermen. Like, I'm not sure I'm totally understanding the need for any of this. We've got all these apparatuses set up. Are they inefficient? Are they costing us a lot of money? I mean, what's the impetus to change this?
Well, so Mike Lee has introduced this bill that land that's adjacent to developed land and has access to, water, electricity, and grid. He says there's a housing shortage, and we have all this land, and we could be addressing that housing shortage by adding to the tranche of possible land to be building on. So that's one way of looking at it. When I see problems, again, if you
okay, let's rewind here for a second. How germane is this argument? I mean, there's a lot of land in the United States. I mean, when people come to this country, they have this notion of how big the United States is, and it's really hard to grasp how big this country really is when you start to drive across it. I mean, most states, just the average state, if you were to just drive pell-mell, nonstop, no breaks, no nothing, you could barely get across most states if you were to just do that for an entire day. Some states are so large that you couldn't even contemplate doing it. If you were to try to travel the length of California, I mean, you're talking about traveling north south the entire length of the state, and that is essentially the height of the country, minus a couple of whatever, Oregon and Washington there on the north end. It's so huge. Like, I mean, even if you were to say, well, we need to have more housing, that's just, I don't know, it seems ridiculous that that's what we're talking about here, because we're not lacking for land in the United States, not even close. Why is this coming up? It just seems like not something that's needed to do. Like, if we're going to say this is how we're going to close our deficit, or this is how we're going to pay off the debts that we owe by selling off the land to private interests, well, I don't know, maybe, but that also doesn't seem like quite the right answer either. So I'm still missing this nuance.
Well, I don't know how much of an impact it's going to have on the prices of homes. In fact, I don't think that it's going to have much, but I do think it would change the patterns and the possibilities of how we live, and also the possibilities for industry. And so, and then again, I think that this is there's an underlying issue about local and state control over these areas. So, and I would add, I mean, to add some nuance in there, let's think about fire. I mean, well, this could be a whole other tangent, but fire management, in Oregon 2 years ago, the federal government was burning was having a prescribed burn on federal land, a federal forest, and they burnt it on a windy day, and the burn got out of hand, and it burned a couple of the ranches that surrounded the area. And those ranchers called the sheriff and had the manager of that federal burn, the person who was in charge, arrested. And he said, I'm immune. I was burning on federal land. And they said, well, you should have been aware of that, and you caused damage to private property. And he was protected by the federal government, and the local population there was very frustrated between that difference in jurisdiction. So we see the likes of friction that occur there. Um, Again, I find it very problematic, just on this notion that you would have two branches of government that are managing land adjacent. Um, I mean, again, going back to some of the ideas behind the foundation of America, it was that there would be one class, but there are some people who have money and power to be engaged with the federal government on that level, and there are a lot of people who don't. So I think part of this narrative about housing is trying to open people's eyes to having a greater stake and greater control about these federally managed lands. And again, I don't think that it's going to have a profound impact on housing costs, but there are so many other issues, because if we think also about this narrative about returning America to industry and to making things and to doing things, it drives me crazy that the federal government's narrative with regards to maintaining and controlling the forests is that they're going to burn them. And they say, oh, people have been, this is a natural process. I don't know what that means, but I do find it astounding that in New Mexico and in Colorado and in the West, we burn acres and acres and acres, millions of acres of trees, and there is no logging industry, and there's no there's no conversation about the sparsity of taking down trees or only allowing people to take deadfall or any of the like. Instead, there is one massive policy that keeps people bottled up in cities and in many places, especially New Mexico. I mean, honestly, especially Colorado and New Mexico both. There is no industry, and the problem is that the federal government owns all the resources and has no interest in the lives of the people there. It's happy with tourism. And if people want to live and contribute to the economy from those areas, it's impossible for them to change. I mean, there's a narrative of possibility. Oh yes, we have a comment and a rulemaking process in the federal government. Well, that works against their interests, and having local control would be much better for them.
So going back to Mike Lee's proposal and how he intended for this to come off, was this part of a larger let's balance the budget initiative, or was it about maintaining local control? Did he say what he was hoping to accomplish with this? Because this isn't the new thing for him. He's been working on this, I believe, for quite some time. So is this something that the constituents of Utah have really been pushing for him to accomplish? Is this something that he's campaigned on and one of the reasons he got elected as a senator?
I don't know if he got elected on this, but it is the general will of especially the state of Utah. So if you think back to Obama's establishment of Bears Ears National Monument, the state of Utah sued the federal government and said this is a great overreach. And Mike Lee, I believe, was elected sometime around then. But anyway, any Utah, Nevada senator, I think it has a lot of reason to be questioning the federal control of land. As to paying off the national debt, I think that did enter into the calculus, and why not? If the federal government has all this land, uh, I mean, I think that they should have to give it to the states. I don't buy into this narrative of them making money off of selling it. But yes, I think that has played into the calculus and the narrative of it from Mike Lee. The I don't know. There's too much to think about this. What are some of your other questions?
Okay, I'm pulling this up because I just wanted to get closer to what Mike Lee said, because I think that this is important to get to the bottom of. He certainly has some talking points. I don't know. I would call these into question. It's like, let's use the word freedom and zone. I don't. What is this supposed to mean? Protect. What is all this? This just seems like absolute hollow rhetoric nonsense. Establish homes. What are we talking about here?
Well, I think again, I made a distinction between public land and private property going back to the beginning of our conversation, and so I'm a climber. I used to climb in Austin, Texas. I have a friend who was rafting along, who's a climber, who went rafting along the Guadalupe River south of Austin, Texas. And he rafted for 3 days, or kayaked on the Guadalupe for 3 days. And he got out near a road, 100 yards from a road. And he walked over to the road with his kayak, and he stuck out his thumb and was hitching a ride back to where he'd left his car 20, 30 miles up the river. And a sheriff came and picked him up and threw him into jail for 3 days. And a rancher who owned who owns the land next to the river had motion detectors and surveillance cameras along the Guadalupe River, because this had happened with other people who were floating the river, who got close to the road and wanted to walk across it. And mind you, my friend had no idea. He assumed that this was a public access point. He was off by 2 miles, actually. If he had gone down a little further down the river, was the actual public access point. But he messed up there. So when we were discussing later, I said to him, did you take it to court? No, I didn't take it to court. I was in jail for 3 days. I paid the fine and I left. I said, you should have taken him to court, and you should have asked the rancher or the landowner to produce his tax receipts and to produce the deed of property for the ranch. Because people talk about property rights, but property rights are not land rights. And it was not always understood in America that they were the same. And if I had been a lawyer and been in the courtroom, I would have asked the landowner the question, what are you paying property tax on? And the property tax bill would have probably had a couple of boxes that relate to the real property, to the houses and the sheds and the barns that he has on the property, and that's what he pays in property tax. And a deed describes a tract of land and conveys.
So this would have been on the real property, on the things that were actually had improved the property that sit atop it, not on the land itself.
Exactly. And we have these concepts of restricting access to our property. But unless he's paying taxes on the entire tract of land, I don't understand why he gets to restrict access from that land. And I think that's a narrative that America needs to have and to return to, because we're entrusting the government to not equate the two of those together and to allow access to land, but we're robbing ourselves of both money put forth by rich people, but when we equate property and land rights, And I say that because
to me, the only thing that really makes sense in doing anything like this, if we were to take these public lands and do something with it, selling it, I don't know, maybe. This seems like we're still in the world of the rich get richer. Those who have money could have already bought land, whatever. Now we're just in the sense of, there really is no come up. Maybe if this proposal was, let's have the Homestead Act of 2025, you go get your 160 acres, you improve it, you put a home on it. This goes into the roster of it, now becomes productive land. It gets onto the tax rosters. There starts to be something productive being done there, maybe. But I don't know, just selling it off just doesn't seem like Americans, the general American, gets anything out of this.
well, but it's already being sold off. In Colorado, the BLM will sell you land if you buy 35 acres. And this is what drives me crazy. So that land is already ostensibly for sale for the richest Americans.
So
And
what changes with Mike Lee doing this? What's the freedom zone? Does that makes it cheaper than what it would have been otherwise?
I think it forces it to, I mean, if you think about how even the regular market works, some people wait for something to be listed for sale. I mean, other things like BlackRock and Blackstone go around and make offers because they have spare cash and they have the ability to do so. Well, it's the same with the federal government. You can go apply to purchase land from the federal government. You have to prove any number of things, that you're going to build a residence on it, that you can pay taxes, that you have access to water. And this is part of why there's 35 acres for sale in Colorado. That's the minimal amount for drilling a well. So I'm all about giving lower income people and also local people more access to that. And part of the reason that I bring up this distinction between land and property rights and land and property taxes is there's not a lot of difference between land and property tax on a quarter-acre lot with a 900 square foot house on it in the middle of a city. But whenever you have a 3 million acre ranch in New Mexico and you're paying taxes on a 10,000 square foot house, and you get to forbid access to those 3 million acres based on the $11,000 that you're paying on that 10,000 square foot house, you're making private fiefdoms, private countries for the incredibly rich people. And who owns those private fiefdoms? Oh, the likes of Jeffrey Epstein in New Mexico. Look up the Zorro Ranch. It's not your it's and I mean, I shouldn't bring up Jeffrey Epstein, but who are the other massive landowners in Colorado and New Mexico? The owner of I forget his name right now, but the owner of the television companies and a media conglomerate owns 3 million acres in New Mexico alone. Ted Turner owns 2 million acres in New Mexico. The CFO for Enron owned the largest ranch in Colorado for a long time. And the thing too about the problems that this brings forth is those areas once upon a time relied on cattle production and lumber production. But now we have incredibly rich people who work on Wall Street or who work in media, and they come in and buy a massive tract of land, and they don't need to sell cattle, and they don't need to take care of the forest. They don't need to quote make money off of that, and so they don't do it. And this is part of the tragedy of the West. Ever since the West was incorporated into the United States, it has been the golden toy, the golden apple of the rich, the radical and progressive, actually the progressive Republicans of the era, the railroads, and large interests. And we have a narrative about it being the place for pioneers and homesteaders, but but a lot of that homesteading came before it was introduced in the United States, and immediately afterwards it began to be carved up for the rich swells from New York City, and from foreign countries to be coming in. So those concerns about foreign interference or corporations are well founded. But the United States didn't avoid that in the past. I mean, even if you look to the east, who owns all the lands? Lumber corporations. If you look in Colorado, who owns a large amount of the mountains today? Mining corporations do. And if we want to look at water rights, the mining corporations own the bulk of the water rights. Yeah, everyone talks and complains about agriculture, but the agriculture use is a pittance compared to the water rights that are held by mining corporations.
Well, it sounds like this bill is going to get reintroduced, that there's more work that he needs to do to meet the rules. Doesn't sound like he's going to let this drop. So this is definitely going to continue to be a part of the discussion. If you think about the amount of land that's really at issue, even within this bill, it seems like it's far less than I thought when I first heard about it. So looking into it a bit more, it seems like this isn't as big of a deal. But entering this into the public discourse and talking about who owns these lands, what are we going to do with it, and is this something that needs to be done to help solve the housing crisis? I'm dubious of that part. So I worry about the ulterior motives that may be at play here, and who's really pulling the strings of Mike Lee. But we'll have to keep an eye on it as this gets reintroduced, because it has been stripped from the bill, and this won't be on the docket anytime soon. And if the midterms go the way that many expect, this may not be in the public discourse for quite some time again. But if he gets it back in to the next time the Congress has a chance to take a look at something, we may be hearing about it again soon.
You say who's pulling the strings of Mike Lee? I think Mike Lee is incredibly earnest and expressing the will of a large group of people in the state of Utah.
So this was okay, because that was a question I had asked. So I guess maybe I missed that was part of it. So this is something he campaigned on, and this was key to him getting elected. Like he's just doing exactly what he said. Because I'm not from Utah, so I have less connection to Mike Lee than just hearing about this and then seeing the reactions and the protests around it.
I mean, this is on the lips of every rural rancher or person who lives in a small town in the west of every state of the nation. But I was going to say too, I mean, this has been something that has been fraught ever since the introduction of all of this Western land in the United States. How do you make the divvying up of it fair? And other politicians, maybe all other politicians, have been confounded by industrial interests as this goes forward. So we're very right to be wary about how they might take advantage of it. But I think there are also greater questions at stake, as what was the idea, and what has been the result of not putting all of this land into local control, because I don't think it's been great. I read there's a great biography by and now I can't think of his name. One of the original mountaineers at the Tetons, and I believe it was written in the 30s, quite some time ago. I wish I could remember his name. I think it's called On Belay. But so this book in the 20s and the 30s, there's a kid who grew up on a ranch outside of Jackson, Wyoming. And the ranchers then were talking about how unfair this notion of a national park being, plopped in the middle of their ranches was, and how it was going to benefit the incredibly rich from New York City, and how this dolt Teddy Roosevelt was confounding notions of American order. And I would say, what are maybe the three most ritzy Bilderberg towns in all of the United States? Jackson Hole's at the top of the list. Sun Valley, Idaho's up there too. Maybe Telluride, Colorado. And what do each one of them have in common? They're surrounded with public land. And if you're a rich person from the city and you can provide for your children, you can send them to go play in this little playground. But that's not something that everyone has access to, or some people make great sacrifices to go and enjoy. And again, I think America was started with notions of equality and giving everybody the same chance. Federal land management hasn't had a history of bringing that with it. So I'll leave it there. That's all I got.
All right. We'll see you next time on FOMO.